So, good morning and welcome back to the lecture Scientific Visualization. The last time I stopped about here at this slide, and the last thought was that I classified volume visualization, direct volume visualization, or the potential approaches for direct volume visualization into roughly 4 categories. So we could say, okay, what are we dealing with? We have apparently a volume, and we want to render that volume directly. So we try to simulate some sort of a semi-transparent, self-glowing, absorbing, gelatinous type of thing. You can imagine this being some sort of this aerogel matter or fire or smoke, well, something that is volumetric in nature. And that's what we're trying to turn our volumetric data into so that we can look at it. And we have some analogy to an actual existing physical object so that scientists that look at the visualization can perceive it better. There's a question, are there any infos about the exam dates? So none from my side. Anything that's related to exam registration, exam dates, whatever, is all part of the Prüfungsamt's job. So I don't make these exam dates. I don't specifically choose them. The dates themselves are of course chosen. I mean, it's an oral exam, but the dates for the registration and the dates that are important for deadlines for the registration, that's nothing that is chosen from my side. When it comes to the actual time and schedule for the oral exam, that is decided towards the end of the semester. So towards the end of the semester, we'll put a poll online onto the Moodle page where you can select a date. And those dates are generally spread over the semester break time. So you can pick one of those. However, what's important right now, and I guess that's what your question is referring to, is there's one sort of deadline date that the Prüfungsamt sets for registering, and I think that has already happened. So the registration deadline already passed, but that date is nothing that we set. Okay, so when it comes to the actual examination date, that's a thing that you can choose from a list of dates. Okay, so I'm not quite sure what exactly you're referring to, so maybe you can clarify that. But that's a good one. Yeah, sure. Well, you could take an exam if you want to. Not that it. No, you can't. There's enough work going on to these exams anyhow. But if you're interested in getting an actual certificate for this course, just sign up at the University of Duisburg-Essen. I mean, there should be some date in the system somewhere. I guess it's generally the first. As I said, it's up to the Prüfungsamt. So generally they set some random date in there because that's necessary for getting these deadlines straight. And it's generally the first day of the semester break or something, because we have oral exams fairly early as well, which is kind of a traditional thing for the Erasmus students, which have to leave, or which generally not have, but generally want to leave pretty early. So we offer an exam right after the lecture times at the beginning of the semester break, and then most of the other students takes the exam later on. But anyways, it's quite some time until the exams, so don't worry, things are happening. The only important thing is that you register, which you should already have, I think, through the Prüfungsamt, otherwise you can't take the exam. Well, actually, I mean, of course, it's more a joke on your side, but I guess it's probably interesting for the other students. The exams are actually either in German or in English, so you can pick what you want. So that's probably interesting information for the ISE students, even though you're technically required to know German, you need a German certificate, right? Nonetheless, I know that this never works out very well, so we do offer the ORAL exams in German and in English, so you can just pick whatever you want. So, but yeah, so those dates will come. Okay, anything else regarding that part? If you haven't registered yet, I think it's late, but I don't know the exact deadline. I might be wrong here, because I never register for my own exams, obviously. So I don't keep track of deadlines. Okay, then let's return to important stuff, not just exams, which are a thing that happens, but that's not really the important part. The important part is that you're all eager to know how scientific visualization works, right? So, yeah, I classified those methods that would, turn data into something that has a visual representation. I classified them into 4 categories. One was to only consider absorption. That would be just like smoke. Smoke generally doesn't glow unless it's very hot, but let's assume it's cold smoke. So then it only absorbs light. Then emission, that's something that is, I guess emission only is a somewhat unnatural phenomenon. So in that case, we would have a glowing material that doesn't absorb anything. It just glows in different intensities. Maybe stars are a little bit like that, but even they absorb light that's behind the star. So then the first sort of reasonable model is absorption and emission. So we have a material, we assume that we have a material that both absorbs light and emits light sort of at the same time. So that would be kind of a fire situation, right? You have a fire where there's smoke that absorbs part, and there's particles that actually glow, and those emit light. So and that's called the emission absorption model, or absorption emission model. And then you can take this a step further and look at materials that not only actively glow or actively or passively absorb energy, but that also passively scatter light. Either in that process, you either gain intensity by light that is coming from various directions and is scattered into your viewing direction, or the opposite, where light that is going into your viewing direction is scattered away and it gets darker. The particular examples would be the typical clouds that you see on the sky. They obviously don't glow by themselves, but they still have a color other than black, unless they're pretty thick. So that would be a typical scattering situation where the light from the sun is scattered through the clouds, and that's also what turns them dark. If it's very thick clouds, because, well, due to the scattering effect, light won't make it all the way through, and it just kind of is scattered away, and then ultimately maybe also absorbed on top of that. So I already mentioned that the first model is a little bit too simple, or the first 2 models, emission only, absorption only, is so simple that it's not very practical in terms of allowing us to perceive an object, because it's so artificial to only consider absorption and only consider emission that we wouldn't be able to properly identify a 3-dimensional structure using that model only. The 2 models at the bottom, so either just considering simple scattering or considering multiple scattering events, is very leads to a very realistic looking volume. So it has shadows and has these concepts of that I just mentioned with clouds, that if something is thick, light is scattered away, and it's all nice, and you can create beautiful images, but due to the complexity of the approach, there's 2 significant drawbacks. One is, well, it's a complex computation, so it takes longer to compute. That is drawback 1. So it's probably not going to work at high quality interactively. And the second one is, it's still an open question whether these additional cues that you get when you have some part of the volume casting a shadow onto another part of the volume, whether those additional cues are actually good or bad, whether they actually add to the spatial perception of the data, or whether they rather add to artifacts that you might misinterpret. So that's sort of an open question. And as far as I know, there's very, very few areas in which these more complicated models are actually being used for exactly that reason. Not so much the performance, that's also some deal, but due to the added danger of artifacts showing up in the image, right? My example was, if some part of the volume casts a shadow into another part of the volume, we might misinterpret that as, well, the shadow, that could be a cancer or whatever. So long story short, emission absorption model is kind of the way to go, at least right now, for visualizing volumes directly. And now, how does that thing work? Let's try to put this concept, this model, into a formula. And then the next step would be to derive a numerical solution of that formula so that we can compute a result. So we always observe these steps. That is, we have data. We pick either develop one model our own, or we just pick a model, in this case from optics, from physics. We pick a model to turn that data into something that has a visual representation. Then we look at the mathematics of that model, and then we use some approach, usually a numerical approach, to turn that mathematical idea, that mathematical concept, to turn that into code and then ultimately render it. Okay, now that we've picked the model, let's look at the theory. Let's look at the mathematics of that model. And it's actually a pretty dead simple idea that leads to a somewhat complicated formula. Complicated not from a purely mathematical point of view. It's actually a pretty short formula, but it would be complicated to solve this, or it is complicated to solve. So let's look at what happens along a ray. Okay, so we'll just consider our screen, and that's what we ultimately want to color, right? So I mean, in visualization, we have usually a screen that we want to assign colors to. So, and we check for each pixel on the screen what amount of light does arrive at that pixel. Okay, so that sounds a little bit awkward, but that's really what you're interested in, right? If you want to color the screen, you want to color each pixel. And how do you color a pixel? Well, it's brighter when there's more light arriving there, and it's darker if there's less light. Okay, so that explains the whole process in black and white. And if you, excuse me, and if you want to do it in color, all you have to do is repeat the process for different frequencies, say red, green, and blue. Okay, done. Now, let's look at one of those rays. So that's the intensity, that's the radiance for those that attend computer graphics as well, or advanced image synthesis. That's the intensity that arrives at one particular pixel, which ultimately gives the pixel the color. And now all we have to figure out is what happens to that intensity. Okay, so that's really the question that you always have to answer in any computer graphics problem. So here's my pixel. So that's the side of the pixel. And here's the light source. Okay, so and light kind of travels from the light source to the pixel, and then ultimately I see it. So what happens is that, let's say I start with some light behind my volume. And this can actually be zero if the background is completely dark, but let's just assume we have some amount of intensity, we have some amount of light that, well, travels in the direction of the pixel. If there wouldn't be any volume in there, whatever, so we would basically deal with a vacuum, then, well, whatever that intensity is would be directly the color of the pixel. But now there's a volume in between. So let's say the volume starts here at S0 and it ends here at the end. Okay, so what is our intensity? What's happening to our intensity? Let's first take this initial intensity and just draw it as some height. Okay, so that's a certain amount of light, right? Say 1 unit, for instance, and then this is what we start. So we say the intensity that I see at a pixel is our initial intensity S0 that we started with. And then what happens along the ray? Say there's a volume here in between. There's a volume that absorbs light. Okay, we decided to pick the emission absorption model. Let's look at the absorption part first. So, and that volume, maybe it absorbs 1% of the light per centimeter, for instance, right? Obviously, the thicker your volume is, the more it'll absorb in the process. So we have to do this absorption per some unit distance. Let's just say I do it per centimeter. Okay, so what happens is that this decreases here. After 1 centimeter, 99% is left, right? In my example here, if the volume absorbs 1% per centimeter, okay? After 1 centimeter, 99% are lost, are still there, and 1% is lost. Now, at the next centimeter, from those 99% remaining, again, 1% is lost. So we're not at 98, we're at a little bit, let's more than that, a little bit more than 98%, right? So we're basically gathering this absorption, this amount of absorbed light, and that's always 99% of the previous one. Okay, so we start with 100%, then 99, then 99 times 99, 99 times 99, and so on and so forth. So what we end up with is some exponential decay, right? Let's just assume for a second that the volume is uniform. So in every centimeter, we lose 1% from not the initial 100%, but from the previous 99%. Okay, so what you see is an exponential or a logarithmic, same thing, just negative exponent. You see this decay here, and that I can express by this exponential function. So I say if it's just the initial intensity that illuminates the point, then I start with this initial intensity and I multiply it by this negative exponential function here, by this logarithmic function, and that is based, what is this exponent based on? It's based on some characteristic of the volume in question, okay? And that's what I call tau here. So I'd simply say, okay, well, that's some tau, the tau would be my 99%, and that should be influenced by the data, right? So that's what happens. So when I look here, I get about half the brightness, and here there's almost none left. Okay, so what is this? Let's look at this tau a little bit more closely, right? So I gave it two parameters. I gave it basically an entry point and an exit point. Okay, I said tau from, say, S1 to S2. So S1 is the entry point and S2 is the exit point. Okay, in between that, I have this influence of the volume. Now, what does this influence amount to? Well, it's this kind of sum, right? So something happens at the first centimeter and the second centimeter, third centimeter, and so on and so forth. So I get a sum over all these influences. Okay. Now, if I look at the sum, not just at a centimeter level, but at infinitesimal small steps, my sum turns into an integral. Okay. So an integral, again, is just it's just an infinite sum over like very, very small, infinitely many small steps. So I basically sum up all the properties of the volume from the entry to the exit point, and that's what this exponent becomes. Okay, so that's the first thing that happens. That would be a purely absorption model, like if I have smoke, right? So smoke would work this way. Now, how do we get the emission into this whole model here? Okay, so let's just plug this. Let's just finish this formula right away. So that's the whole formula. Let's now explain the second part here. Let's explain the second integral. Notice that, let me just go one slide back here, right? We start with this energy, it decays, and this integral here is just the explanation of where this exponent comes from. Okay, so this is still here. So this is kind of in this function here, right? But for the sake of clearing my slide a little bit, I hide this part here. So now we have a different integral. That's important. That's a different integral. Okay, so this integral now, this is modeling the emission. Because what happens if we emit light? Let's say I pick a random point here. Let's say I just pick this point here, right? Okay, so what happens at this particular point? Let's say my volume glows here, right? What then happens is that, well, the intensity rises again. So on top of that red curve here, I add a little bit of intensity at this point. So we've got the initial intensity that decayed to a point here, but it's not at zero yet. So I add a little bit of intensity. So that's a point in the volume that glows. and then again shines into my direction. So for each point inside the volume, on top of this absorption coefficient, I also have an emission coefficient because, well, it's the emission absorption model. Now that light in turn, from that point on, not from the very beginning as zero, but from that point on now, decays. Okay, so from this S tilde point up to the exit point S, or the point that we're looking at S, it again is reduced, and it's reduced by the same way. So it's now absorbed by the very same function. So this here is the same than this one, except that it's now only absorbed from here to here. It's of course not absorbed all the way. So the only difference is that this decay here, this absorption, right? It's only being considered from the point of emission to the exit point. And then ultimately we sum this all up. So again, this is just a sum. So this integral is again this infinite sum. So we repeat this process for this point here, for this point, pretty much for all the points. So everywhere I have a potential emission, and everywhere this adds all up and gets all reduced along the way. So we say, well, what's the total light that I perceive at the end, so that I want to render? So the total energy is simply the background light absorbed all the way, plus all those little energies along the way, all those little added intensities along the way, again absorbed from their point of creation to the exit point. Okay, so this whole thing might look a little bit complicated. Okay, so yeah, and then we sum it all. It might look a little bit complicated, but I guess at least the explanation is pretty straightforward. Okay, and again, notice that this here, this function, this exponent function here, is again this integral from the first to the last point. So what you get is, in summary, right, is some constant, some background illumination, multiplied by an exponential function to a negative power of an integral, plus an integral times some, again, factor times the negative power of yet another integral. So there's a ton of integrals in there, and those are in general impossible to compute. Why is it in general impossible to find to actually solve this? Because we have for a function to be differentiable and to be integratable, I suppose is the term. You need this function to have a few properties. So for instance, it should be continuous. And this function is obviously highly discontinuous because we have different points in the volume. So we generally have a discrete lattice. We have different points in the volume, so they jump around widely depending on what your sample points are. So what we generally can't really do is find a closed form solution for a volume. Oh, good morning. So but what we're looking for is a discrete solution, as we usually do. So we have discrete data, we have discrete inputs, so we usually end up with discrete solution. So instead of looking for a mathematical closed form solution to the integral, we try to approximate it by some discrete sum. So instead of looking at these actual integrals, we turn those integrals back into sums and literally do the stepping along the way. So what I said at the beginning, okay, let's look what happens every centimeter. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So we sample this array at a certain sampling distance, and there's a multitude of ways how to choose those samples, but we sample this array, do some sort of computation, and then combine it, essentially summing it up in some clever way. Okay, so that's what we end up doing. So let's look at a very straightforward approach to achieve this discretization. And since we're dealing here with arrays, and we want to sample these rays, the easiest approach is to, well, do some sort of ray marching or ray casting algorithm. Okay, so we literally follow these rays, mathematically compute those rays as entry point, exit point, and then compute sample points along the ray. So what we want to do is we shoot rays through the volume, so we can shoot them from the back. So we basically, for each pixel, we find the ray. And how do we compute the ray? Well, to define an array, you need 2 points. You need its origin and its direction. Okay. What is the origin? Well, the origin, or the target in this case, I suppose, if we say the array goes that way, the target could be the eye point, or should be the virtual eye point of the viewer, which is either tracked. So if you use eye tracking, such as in eye tracking setup, if you have a monitor that supports eye tracking, or if you use a virtual reality setup, you also generally at least track the head, and the eyes move pretty rigidly with the head. You either set this to a fixed parameter or you track the eye, and then you have the pixels on screen, and then you simply can compute the difference between the pixel center coordinate and the eye position, and you get your direction. So for each pixel, we can compute one ray. We can compute multiple as well, but let's just stick with one ray here for simplicity's sake. So and that ray intersects the volume, or it doesn't. If it just passes by, whatever, we just assign the background color to that particular pixel. But if it intersects the volume, then we sample that volume at, well, some sort of sampling rate. So we get a bunch of points along the rate. Okay, so here I try to depict this. So if your volume is just made up of simple hexahedral cells, cubes, then you could figure out for any point that you're interested in along this ray, in which cell am I, and then you could compute a value here. So here is this again shown. So if I just look at this one ray through a pixel, okay, so there's the eye, there's just one pixel that I've drawn here to simplify things a little bit. We can simply repeat the process for every pixel to get the final image. So we've got this one ray, and then we sample that ray at some regular, in this case, regular sampling distances, right? So, well, say every centimeter or whatever. I compute the position of that sample, and then I figure out, okay, what is, and that is now one cell, that is the largely enlarged cell. So say this sample point here happens to be inside that cell. That's the one I'm interested in. Okay, so how do I get the value at that point? Well, I could just interpolate from the 8 neighboring values, the 8 vertices of that cell. I can just interpolate the point inside that cell, for instance, by trilinear interpolation, and I know what's the volume's value there. So what is the, say, CT absorption, or what is the density of some simulation, whatever. So I just generate a value. And then I turn that value into something that has a visual representation, such as color and opacity. And opacity really amounts to this level of absorption. Like the more opaque something is, the more it absorbs what's going on. And at the same time, the more it emits, right? If something is opaque and has a color, it emits more light than if it's transparent and has a color. So this transfer function that I explained in the last session, this is exactly this mapping from the numbers in the data to that visual representation, which here in our functional representation represents this absorption and the emission coefficient at the same time. Okay, so this opacity part is responsible for both emission and absorption, and the color component then specifies what exactly is emitted, right? What frequency, say red, green, and blue is our color model, then how much do we radiate in red and green and blue at that point? Okay? So now if we repeat that process, say from some pixel into the volume, or the other way around, it doesn't really matter, into both. Let's just do it this way from the pixel for a second. Then I have to sample, right? I find my points along the ray. I figure out what do these samples, what do they hit? So I have to do some sort of interpolation, and for that I use some interpolation kernel. I've just drawn this here as a cone, but in general that can be pretty much anything. In our case, it's most often just trilinear interpolation. So we interpolate from neighboring values and we get some sort of answer. Okay. So now if I step to the next sample point, I again repeat the process. Compute the sample, I compute the interpolation at that sample, and this here, for instance, leads to whatever, I don't know, a blue cloud. I take the next sample, and again, I end up with a little bit of blue. I take the next sample, I end up with a little bit of blue, and so on and so forth. And then ultimately, I'm out. So what happens, or what's supposed to happen along the ray with my pixel value? Let's just go back. So here, so this part should be pretty much transparent. And then I want this blue thing to be what, semi-transparent, and I want to have this like really solid red part inside there. So without knowing yet how to do this process, how to combine those values, let's just see what we would expect. Okay, so again, first sample ends up in nowhere, or it ends up in the volume, but we don't find anything here. So we would expect our color so far to be still pretty much nothing, say black, and our accumulated opacity, so how opaque is the object so far, should also be 0 because we haven't accumulated anything yet. Now if I do my first step into the volume, I expect my color to become slightly bluish, right? I said this is a pretty transparent bluish thing. Just imagine that would be this aerogel example from the last stream. Okay, so and it's a little bit opaque, so I can't really see anything behind this at its full extent. It's a little bit bluish tinted, right? So it's a little bit blocked. Now, as I progress through the blue part, my result should be bluer and bluer, and whatever comes next should be blurrier and blurrier, or should be less visible. Okay, so this continues, and at some point, anything that is behind that point, I can't see anymore, right? Because it, like, this red here would have to traverse so much blue that it would be completely absorbed, or, well, absorbed to a point where it's practically invisible. And I can tell this by an opacity accumulation of 100%. So then I traverse into this solid red object, it shouldn't have an impact. So what we can tell from this simple example is the following. We can't just sum up the values. Okay, so I said this integral is a sum, and that's correct. We'll end up with some sort of a summation, but we can't just take the values as they are and sum them up, right? Because obviously, if you accumulate, if you have an opaque object here and there's something behind that, you don't see that behind, so it doesn't have an influence anymore. So something has to happen. And of course, light travels the other way around, right? It comes from the back, but we can still traverse this ray in both directions. We can traverse it from the front, just see, okay, how much accumulation, how much opacity do we accumulate? In that case, whatever comes from the back wouldn't have an influence. So you can do this really both ways. And then you repeat this process for every pixel, right? So what you get in the end for all of the pixels is some sort of color and opacity distribution. Okay, in this case, I would expect this in the center to be pretty blue and very opaque, and at the like the rays that barely touch the objects, well, they're not that blue, and I can potentially still see something behind that. And that's also what we had in the example. Like, remember this image where there was someone holding this block of aerogel? It was very bluish in the center, and then it would get brighter and brighter and more transparent towards the outer parts of that brick that the person was holding. Okay, so that's exactly what we would expect in reality. Okay, so now the question that remains is, like, how do we do this combination? Like, how do we combine all of these colors into one, all of the colors that we find along the ray? I said we can't just sum them up. I mean, there's got to be some order dependence here, and if I would sum up things, it would be order independent, right? So, but nonetheless, even without knowing that, we know a couple of things. We know how to interpolate, we know how to get to the actual color values, that's the transfer function, and then just as a side note, we can compute additional lighting effects on top of that. So what I didn't include so far is, like, how would a light source interact with surfaces, not just the background light, but some other light. And we could include other effects, which I said we don't want to, such as the shadowing, scattering, all these things. We could include them as well, and those would just complicate this ray tracing process. So you would have basically end up with the rays going off into multiple directions. Before I get to the first point, like how do we actually accumulate that, I want to show you actual photographs of pieces of art by a Chinese artist. Okay, so you can find those on the web. So if you just look for the Chinese artist's name, which I put on the slide here, you can find that. If you download the slides via Moodle, there's actually a link And this artist, among a couple of things, what he does is he creates volumetric pieces of art. So here you see a face, for instance, and here's a few other ones. I don't know exactly what that thing on the left is, but that's obviously on the right hand. He creates pieces of art by taking, let me go one slide back, by taking a bunch of sheets of glass and coloring or etching each piece of glass. So he takes a stack of sheets of glass, and you can see the face from the side, and then he just draws or etches on every piece of glass. So, and then if you look at this stack from the right direction, from the front, you can actually see the volumetric object. And you can move around a little bit up to the point where at some point you'll actually see how it's made, but you can move around a little bit and still get the volumetric expression, right? So here, for instance, for this hand, he apparently also used color. And that is surprisingly close to our approach, because what does he do? Well, he slices this volumetric object into at regular intervals, right? So there's one slice of glass after the other, and those are regularly spaced. And for each slice, by painting on this, he determines a particular color and opacity. Oh, sounds pretty familiar. And then in the end, by just putting all those slices onto a stack, we get a final result. So that's apparently one way of dealing with volumes, right? So we can just break this down into discrete pieces of glass and then get a result out. Okay, and you can sell this as art. So how can we do this computation in a similar fashion? So let's look at these sheets of glass. Let's look at what's happening. Okay, so let's just look at one sheet of glass here. So that's just one of those pieces of glass, and this is the light coming back from the back and being visible to the eye. Okay, so we've got some incoming color, or we've got some incoming intensity. I just call this C in here, and something comes out. And what I'm interested in is, what do I see, right? What's C out? And that's actually surprisingly simple to compute. It's just a linear interpolation. Because what is C out? Well, it's influenced by the opacity, alpha, and the color of that specific sheet of glass. The more opaque this is, the more of the color I see, right? If it's colored, if this is painted in red, if it's completely opaque, all I see is red. If it's completely transparent, I don't care if it's red. all I see is the back. Okay, so the color that I ultimately see is a mixture of the background color and the color of the object. And how is this mixed? Well, it's mixed by the opacity. Okay? Let's say the opacity is between 0 and 1. Let's define this as between 0 and 1. Then again, 0 means this thing is transparent. 1 means it's completely opaque. So all I have to do is combine this color, this previous color, C in, with the color of the object, C, by this parameter alpha. When this is 1, all I see is C, and none of what I see in the back comes from the back. If it's 0, it's vice versa. So I just take 1 minus alpha times the background color plus alpha times this current color. Okay, and that's just a linear interpolation between the two terms, or a convex combination, or whatever you want to call it, but this is dead simple. Okay, now this is one piece of glass. What happens when I have a stack of pieces of glass, just like this artist did? Well, all I have to do is repeat the process iteratively for each piece of glass. So I start here at the back. I got some incoming color that is modulated with this function here, and I get an outgoing color. This becomes the incoming color of the next step. It's again modulated now by those parameters here, becomes the outgoing color, and so on and so forth. So what I have to do to compute this iteratively, I simply have to say, well, the output of one stack element is the input of the next sheet of glass. And then I just iterate through all sheets of glass and I get the ultimate result. So I get the color that comes out of this entire stack. And that is generally referred to as the back to front strategy. Okay, why? Because, well, we traverse this stack back to front. Okay, what's interesting about this whole thing, I mean, this is a dead simple equation here, right? 1 minus alpha times one parameter plus alpha times the other parameter. That's linear interpolation. We've used this in this lecture a ton of times already. This is also the ingredient for bilinear interpolation, and it's ingredient for trilinear interpolation. So it's kind of the basic formula that we always use. Now, what's interesting is if you execute this over and over again, right, for each piece of glass here, let's think what would we get? What type of function would we expect? What happens if we plug this function into itself? That's what really happens, right? So if we execute it one after the other, the output becomes the input of the next one. So the output of one slice is the input of the next slice. So in other words, after 2 slices, I have something like 1 minus alpha of the second slice times, now comes the previous result, 1 minus alpha of the previous slide times input color plus alpha of the previous slide times alpha of the previous slide plus, now back to the second one, alpha of the second slice times color of the second slide. So long story short, due to plugging this in, we start to accumulate a ton of 1 minus alphas and alphas here. So in the end, what we get is an exponential function, right? Because we plug a multiplication into itself, and repetitive multiplication is what we call an exponential function. So this here, when we execute this iteratively, ends up being exponential, and guess what? It ends up being exactly that exponential that I just called the rendering, the volume rendering equation. So this strategy here, as simple as it looks, if you compute this to the limit, meaning check what happens if I just insert it over and over again into itself and then simplify the function, it actually becomes this sum, and if you do infinitely many steps, it becomes the integral from before. So this here is the iterative solution to the volume integral from before, to this crazy integral of integral whatever type of thing. Okay? And back to front is one way to solve this integral numerically, to break it down into discrete steps, right? That's what we do here. We break it down into discrete steps and solve it. We can also reverse the computation. We can compute this from front to back, and then those formulas change slightly, okay? The idea is pretty much the same. It's still a linear combination. You just see that the factors change a little bit, right? It's still 1 minus alpha times alpha, but they end up getting multiplied to only the current component. And that's sort of clear, right? If I kind of go from front to back, you can again develop this intuition and say, okay, well, what happens with my intensity? Well, the intensity that I've had so far is influenced by what's now happening. And what I also need to do is I need to keep track of a second parameter. Notice that here I have one function. Well, and this is just the definition of that I have to execute this over and over again. And here I suddenly have 2 functions plus this definition that I have to execute this over and over again, which I left out here. So here I also have to keep track of the alpha. I have to keep track of what have I accumulated so far, because all that I've had here has an influence on how does that color here behave. Effectively, these functions are nothing but what you get if you would take the previous function, would just plug them into, say, you do this for 10 slices. You get this long function of this plugged into itself 10 times. And then you resort this by the components the other way around, not from back to front, from front to back, then you automatically end up with that function. So it's actually pretty simple to show this. And if you think about this for a while, you can also develop an intuition why that makes sense. Okay. So, and now we have this procedure how to take those sampled values and combine them into a final color. So now we can plug that in turn into our ray tracing process and combine either front to back or back to front, combine those samples to get one consistent color. Notice that when there's a little bit of a difference in what cool things, what possibilities do we have, whether we go front to back or back to front. Mathematically, with unlimited precision, you get the exact same result. With limited floating point precisions, you generally get a little bit of a different result due to floating point noise. But there's another interesting take, and that is if I actually do this whole computation sort of the wrong way, right, front to back, which is the wrong way in terms of how light actually traverses or how energy is actually exchanged. But if we do it sort of the wrong way, there's one cool thing that we can do, and that's called early ray termination. Because what we can do is, if we start from the front and we realize, oh, we've accumulated 100% or close to 100%, say 99% of the opacity, we don't have to continue, right? We know that nothing, whatever comes, will have an influence on the light that I see. Okay, so that's why generally we prefer to do this whole computation sort of the wrong way. It doesn't have a negative drawback in terms of, well, we potentially lose something here. But it has one giant advantage, that we can terminate rays early, and hence we can save computational time. Okay, so generally we do this from the front towards the back, but both is possible. Okay, so what we end up with is some sort of a loop, right? We have some sort of for loop for ray from entry point to exit point. And in between, we might terminate if we want to, if we've accumulated something. So there's potentially a break inside that loop that breaks out, that bails out early when we've accumulated enough opacity. And since I use the word accumulate so often, the whole method is actually also referred to as accumulate. Okay, so this idea of using the emission absorption model, turning that into the volume rendering equation, turning the volume rendering equation into the simple 1 minus alpha times alpha process, for instance, for front to back accumulation, that is all called accumulate. Okay, and here you see a typical example of an image that you would get by that process, right? So this is obviously a human upper body part, so it's head and shoulders. I've specified the transfer function so that the skin-air transition has a fairly bright red color, and but it's still transparent enough so that we can see the pretty opaque bone structure. Okay? We can visualize this this is a meta visualization. So what happens along a ray? So along a ray, so this here is kind of my ray direction. This is x is depth. So for each ray, we have a distribution of colors and opacities. And what the ray does, it kind of marches through this distribution of intensities and opacities and accumulate them. Okay, so by the means of that accumulation function, 1 minus alpha, alpha, and so on and so forth. Okay, and at some point we can stop if we employ early ray termination, or we would process this all the way to the end, but at this point we would just multiply everything with 0 that's coming in. Okay, so that's accumulate. Okay, but there's other ways. So we could take a few steps back and say, okay, well, we don't want to do this emission absorption model. What happens if we just choose a completely different model? And there's a couple of different models, and I just visualize them all using the same depiction here for the ray. So there's accumulate in there. What we could also do is we could just compute the average along the ray, right? I just take all the values, I sum them up and divide them by the number of rays. So I compute the average. There's really no easy physical correspondence to that. Okay, so it's a different model. It's a different computational model that we use. I can't really, it's pretty hard to find a reasonable object in reality that would have this behavior. It's sort of like how X-ray behaves. In a sense, I mean, X-ray is, again, it's typical absorption model actually, but since there's very little absorption going on, we could say, well, what we get out is sort of the average, actually the sum of all the absorptions, but it leads at least visually to a similar result. Okay, so average, there's no real physical object to that, but it gives us a result that looks sort of like X-ray. More on that in a second. What I could also do is, I mean, since it's just a mathematical computation, I could just take the maximum, right? I could just follow that ray and I just pick the maximum value, the maximum intensity, and that's what I assign. I could also assign the minimum intensity, but that's usually not very useful because the minimum intensity for most data sets is just noise, right? So the maximum intensity is the most important contribution along that ray. So that might be interesting. It's actually called maximum intensity projection. It's very popular in medicine. What I could also do is what's called first. So first is a little bit different from the other. So here, what I do for first is I don't compute a brightness or intensity value. I compute a position. for each ray, I choose a specific value and I say, well, tell me along that ray, when was the first time that I encountered that value? Okay, so for instance, let's say that 0, 1, so maybe my value is 0.2. And along that ray, that was the position where I first encountered 0.2. Okay, so first is a little bit different in that it computes a position rather than an intensity value. All the other methods, they compute intensity value. But nonetheless, all these values compute all these methods compute one value per pixel. Okay, intensity, 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 and here's one position. Let's look at this first method for a second because it's very different from the other. What I get is a bunch of positions in the end, right? When I compute for each pixel, for each ray, and I shoot one ray through each pixel, when I compute a position, I get a, well, set of positions. Now, visualizing these positions directly isn't really very useful. And visualizing the first value is even less useful because it's constant, right? I mean, that's the thing that I choose. But what I can do is I can take all of those positions and they make up a surface, right? I mean, they're just basically sample points. And I could combine them into one surface and then just draw the surface using some sort of shading here. And that allows me to do something that is very similar to the isoline extraction, but now in 3D to this isosurface extraction. Okay, so I basically extract with this first method, I extract a part of the surface as seen, and the surface corresponds to that value that I've chosen for first. For instance, 0.2. So that corresponds to the surface that would have 0.2. Only from that direction. So I don't compute the entire surface. I only get the depiction of that surface as seen from that direction that I currently look at. Okay. But that's also a very useful visualization. It does have a drawback though. It ignores a ton of data. Right? Anything that's below first is ignored, and anything that's above first. So I basically just get one point out. But still, it allows you to extract surfaces that don't really exist in reality, right? But it generates surface-like structures. And surfaces are a thing that we're pretty good at interpreting. So here's another example. That's a CT scan of a tooth. On the left and on the right, you see different accumulate version with different transfer functions. And in the center, you again see a first visualization. So I've chosen a relatively low value here. So first terminates fairly early. And I can't look inside, but I can at least see the surface of the tooth. Okay, so, and you can imagine that you might want to combine multiple of these first versions. More on that again later. Okay, but that's accumulate here. That is first. Now let's look at the others quickly. Average, I said average sort of results to something that looks somewhat similar to X-ray itself. Okay, it's not X-ray. X-ray is really just straightforward absorption unless you radiate yourself, which I hope none of you do. So in that case, there's no emission going on along the path. So it's a purely absorption model. But if we compute the average, we get something out that sort of looks like X-ray. And the same is true for max. So if you do a max, computation maximum intensity projection, as it's often referred to, you again get something that is similar to X-ray. What max is generally used for, or let's first go back to average. Average is sometimes used again in a setup where actually X-rays are used to acquire the data. So when you have a CT modality, sometimes people prefer an average visualization for the volume because it sort of recreates, at least approximates, the original X-ray image that I would have seen when I would have looked at this from one direction. In particular, practitioners, doctors, they're used to looking at X-ray images, so they can also directly interpret these average images, even though the entire 3D structure is lost, right? If you compute average, obviously, you completely lose the three-dimensional structure because it doesn't matter anymore where your samples are. Particularly when you start to animate these average images, it looks very awkward to me because you can't tell what's front and what's back. All right, but anyways, I know that this is used in the clinical practice, in particular for doctors that are used to interpreting 2D X-ray images and that don't want to burden themselves with the whole 3D information because they're so good at looking at the 2D image that they can just reconstruct the 3D structure from their experience. MIP is again something that is often used in the medical context. And here I put in that it's often used for instance, MR images, but it's also used for a certain CT image types. It's usually used when you use some sort of contrast agent. When you have some sort of liquid or you have some material in your object. Well, and that could be some contrast agent injected in the bloodstream. So that's a material in your patient's bloodstream that is very different from the rest of the value. So for instance, if you inject something that absorbs X-rays very strongly, okay, some material in that you inject into a patient's bloodstream that absorbs X-ray very heavily, then those points in the vessels or in the organs where that contrast agent is accumulated will have a significantly higher value than the rest. And the same is true for magnetic resonance angiograms. So in this case, again, you use MR, and I told you MR is the physics are very different, but the result is sort of similar from CT, except that instead of using X-ray, you use magnetic field and you capture the magnetic resonance of the tissue to a changing magnetic field. But the outcome is sort of similar. You get a volume. It's just based on some magnetic properties of the tissue. And here again, you can inject a contrast agent into the patient's bloodstream that then maybe accumulates in the brain or accumulates in the liver or wherever. And that creates very strong magnetic resonance. So you again get very high values at very specific points. Hopefully those points you're interested in. Now, if you're just interested in those points in the volume that have a significantly higher value than the rest, you could set a transfer function that puts everything to 0 except for very high values, but you could also look for those high values directly. So you just say, okay, well, give me the maximum value. And that's what the maximum intensity projection is used for. Again, maximum intensity projection has this drawback that it drops the 3D information, right? The maximum along array is the same from both ways, obviously. So again, you lose the 3D information, but that is considered by many particular medical practitioners actually an advantage, because they say, well, it's just a 2D image. I just look at that and I don't care if I look from the front and back. And here are examples of a MIP visualization and a cumulate visualization of the same data set. So on the right, you have the maximum intensity projection, and the left, there's the accumulate. And here you only see the points of maximum intensity. Okay, so you see how the vessels are, they kind of pop out, and also the bone structure here in that case. Okay, so that was obviously a CT contrast agent image, because otherwise the bones wouldn't show up. Okay? So maximum intensity projection, accumulate, first, and average. Those are a bunch of things you could imagine, but you can basically imagine anything else. You just have to be able to make sense of the results. So any way of taking the sample points along the array and combining them into a single value will do, as long as you can make sense of that. Accumulate is based on this physical model of this glowing absorbing gel, and the others are sort of based on more of a hand-wavy idea. But as long as a scientist can make sense of that, can answer a question, they are valid options, right? And that's a big difference between computer graphics, as I teach it, as I consider it here, and visualization. Okay, so computer graphics or advanced image synthesis generally has the goal of recreating reality as closely as possible or as fast as possible with some reasonable approximation. And this is very different from visualization here. Here we also generate images, so in a sense it's also computer graphics. But the ultimate goal is not to create something that looks nice, that looks realistic. The ultimate goal is we have a question at hand, right? How do we need to deal with it? Fracture. Does a patient have a brain tumor or whatever. So we have a question at hand, and whatever leads to a visualization that allows anyone or some specific person to answer that question efficiently is fine. So it doesn't have to be realistic or anything. As a matter of fact, it turns out for most situations, we actually do not want this to be realistic, right? Why? Why would that be the case? Well, if we're just going for a realistic visualization, we might as well look at the patient directly, right? Considering medicine for a second, right? If I'm just interested in a super realistic rendering of a human being, I might just, as a doctor, say, okay, please undress, I'll look at you right away. I mean, you get the thing straight and without any artifacts or any computer involved, right? So if you just want to look at the patient directly, you don't need any visualization in the process. So apparently we need to do something on top of that. And the same is true also for any other domain. It's not just medicine, right? We don't need to render clouds in a very realistic way. I might just look at the sky, I see the cloud, super realistic, right? I mean, nature gets things pretty realistic in general, right? But what I'm interested in is maybe cloud density or so. And for that, I do a different volume visualization, okay? So it's kind of an interesting insight that often we don't want things to be realistic because reality gets in the way of discovery, sometimes at least. Okay, so that's it for the first part today. That's it for kind of the basic idea of how can we model something and how do we follow rays through a volume. Yeah. So an interesting insight is that this direct volume rendering is a very popular method in many domains of science, and for quite a while now, about, I would say maybe 20 to 30, 25 to 35 years maybe, there's one piece of hardware that gets used throughout the board to generate these types of visualization, and those are graphics cards, or in short, graphics processing units, in short, GPUs. So while there used to be other ways to do this volume visualization for quite a while, and there was actually dedicated hardware even being developed in the 90s. At some point, researchers and also engineers realized, so we have these graphics cards and they're so good at doing volume visualization, we'll not look at anything else. And that's sort of state of the art today. So that's why I want to dedicate a specific portion of this lecture to how do we do volume visualization with these GPUs, graphics processing units, and why. Or let's maybe first start with the why and then say how. Starting with the why is always a good idea. And what I'm talking about specifically is this branch here, direct volume visualization, right? So slicing, just cutting one slice through, trivial. Indirect, again, that's an open topic that will be the topic of that will basically be the next topic once I'm done with this here. Okay, so let's figure out why are graphics cards so good at doing direct volume rendering that they are pretty much the only piece of hardware that does this these days. Okay, so why GPUs? And here I just picked a random point in time, which is, I guess, somewhat 5 years ago, but the story is this is true today. So the numbers just grow, but the basics are still the same. So if I compare any random graphics card, I happen to pick an NVIDIA card here, but the same is true for an AMD card, and the same is even true for an Intel graphics card, which is usually integrated into their CPUs. But still, what you see is that a graphics card at some point in time has a certain performance, right? It's about 9 teraflops here. At the same time, a high-end CPU has a significantly lower performance. Right? We end up with 0.2 teraflops. So the raw compute power of graphics cards is, at least from the point on where graphics cards were actually able to do reasonable computation, which was roughly 20 years ago. From that point on, the performance of a graphics card at some point in time compared to the high-end CPU of a system was always significantly higher. And the same is still true. CPUs get faster, graphics cards get faster. Okay, so now you might say, well, cool, if they're so incredibly fast, why don't we just use them for everything? Well, it turns out they're good at certain things, in particular running benchmarks to compute teraflops, and they're not so good at other things. Here's again another example. That's from the PlayStation 3. Again, just some random point in time. That thing had a cell processor, which was by the time it was released, was really an incredible piece of hardware for two reasons. A, it was incredibly hard to program. It's a pain, and that's probably why it wasn't very successful. But it was immensely powerful, right? Again, the raw numbers of that chip were immensely impressive. Okay, so it was a very highly parallel chip. It was designed for many different purposes, and it was really only used for the PlayStation and a bunch of integrated controllers in Sony devices. So they used it in their Blu-ray players as well. But what's a flop? That's a floating point operation. Okay, that's probably a good question. That's floating point operation. Okay, so generally a multiply add. Okay, gigaflops per second is like how many? So floating point per second, let's first do this. How many floating point operations can you do per second? Well, giga is obviously then a million. A billion of those operations. Okay, so it's a measurement of performance. Okay? So, and even for that, so let's just pick that PlayStation 3 for a second. It's obviously pretty outdated. We have PlayStation 5s. And it's not like you can buy them, but they're technically out. But nonetheless, if you compare that super incredible cell processor with this immensely high performance, you get 200 gigaflops. And then that PlayStation 3 had a pretty low performance graphics card also built in, right, compared to the PC graphics cards shortly released after that. But nonetheless, that thing had 1.8 teraflops. Okay, notice 1 gigaflop and teraflops. So those were 1,800 gigaflops. So the entire PlayStation, that's how Sony back in the days announced the PlayStation. It's a 2 teraflop game controller, or it's a 2 teraflop game controller. I think it's the thing you hold in your hand. It's a game station, whatever, right? Console, that's the term, right? It's a 2 gigaflop gaming console, which was really mind-blowing, right, at that time. But 1.8 of those gigaflops came from the average, not so super high-end graphics card, and only, literally 10% of the performance came from that super high performance chip. So you can see that somehow, for some awkward reason, and notice the difference in clock speed, right? So this thing runs at 500 hertz, and that thing, the cell processor, ran at more than 3 gigahertz. And I don't know exactly when the PS3 release date was, but that was ages ago, right? I mean, even today, our processors are usually clocked slower than 3.2 gigahertz, right? So I think modern processors, at least the ones that you actually want to buy, are around 2 to 3 gigahertz, right? So it turns out at pretty much any point in time, graphics cards would beat CPUs. Yeah, it could be 2008, yeah. So maybe roughly 13 years ago. So that's ancient, right? Nonetheless, at any point in time, pretty much, GPUs have beaten CPUs, okay? So here I put together a little bit of history, and it's small text on purpose because I don't want you to go through each and every step, or I don't want to go through this, so you can look at that. But my key point is that at some point in time, and that was pretty much around 2000, so it was actually probably 2002, roughly 20 years ago, when DirectX 9 came out, and that was roughly 20 years after we actually had sort of dedicated graphics cards that would do something other than just convert the signal into something that a monitor can use, right? So at around 1980s, graphics cards started to do actual computations instead of just changing signals from one level to the other. So about 20 years later, they started to be useful for actual computation. And from that point on, we had a bunch of achievements. And again, this stopped 10 years ago because the story continues, but the basic trend is the same. So here's another image to depict that, and you should probably notice that that's an image I took from an NVIDIA presentation, so it might be a little bit biased towards some company, but the bottom line is correct. This is the performance of graphics cards. They kind of skyrocket, and then there's CPUs, which sort of sit here at the bottom, okay? So I mean, they're all exponential functions, but apparently this one exponential here flies off. Okay, and here's again a graph. It's a more abstract graph that gives you the basic idea. Graphics cards started slow, kind of exploded. CPUs also do. And just as a side note, kind of networks, they are also there, but they tend to be even slower. So interconnects, they can also exchange networks by interconnects. Interconnects, they tend to jump from one level to the other, right? When a new generation is released, you generally have significant jumps, but it's slower compared to the rest. So that's a thing to keep in mind later on, that any type of network, and that includes interconnect on a board, right? On one board. So basically CPU, GPU, for instance, interconnect also falls into this category here. They are generally way slower than the computational advancements that we get. So why are graphics cards so cool, and why do we still use CPUs? As a matter of fact, there were actually approaches to get rid of CPUs. Funny enough, but the big deal, the big performance difference comes from parallelization. So graphics cards are immensely parallel, right? I mean, if you spend tons of money these days and you buy a super high-end AMD or Intel CPU, you might get a CPU with, I think, 128 cores. I guess that's pretty much the limit. If I read the recent news correctly, I think AMD sells a processor with 128 cores, but they are super expensive, right? If you buy a cheap graphics card, right, the cheapest one that you can get, I mean, cards are kind of hard to get these days, but if you buy a 100 euro graphics card or 50 euro graphics card, or get one from trash, like literally go to some trash and pull out a graphics card, it probably has 500 to 1,000 processors on it, right? Things that people throw away, right, that you find on the streets, have 10 times the processors than the latest and greatest CPU that you would get for a ton of money. Okay, so that's really the big deal. So graphics cards are super parallel. Okay, and it's not just the number of processors that is high. So pretty much anything around that is highly parallelized. Okay, so there's this concept of parallel access to the memory. Okay, so you don't have that much memory on a graphics card as you have on a CPU. I mean, the graphics cards tend to have tons of gigabytes of memory. I think, like, what's the recent graphics card, high-end graphics card? 32, 64 gigs of memory. However, if you buy a card with that much memory, you probably have a CPU that also has 512 gigabyte of memory. Okay, so so they are pretty. They don't have the amount of memory, but it's generally faster memory. Okay, because you have this parallel access and you want faster memory. Can you recycle GPUs? Well, it depends on how you define recycle, right? I mean, I can certainly take a trash PC, and most of them actually work, or at least work to some degree, and you could use them just fine. And you can also go through the process of taking the chip off a GPU, desoldering that, right? You just have to heat the whole thing up and then reconnect that. But that would be a pain to do, I guess. But yeah, if you're just into parallel computations, and that's the whole crux of this thing. This architecture, a graphics hardware, works immensely well if your problem is parallel in nature, meaning if you can use those 1,000 processors, right, or these 10,000 processors in current graphics card, right? I was talking about trash. If I look at high-end graphics cards, they have 10,000 processors. Right? So if I have a problem that parallelizes to 10,000 processors, and that's what these benchmarks do, that compute the teraflops, they of course are tuned to parallel architectures, you can get this humongous amount of power. If I have a serial problem, and if I have a problem that just keeps one processor busy, those graphics cards suck. I mean, they are clocked at significant lower speeds. They are restricted in some ways in what they can do. So they're just not such a great idea. So I would normally argue if I do word processing, it's probably not the best idea. Now, that is not entirely true these days, because word processing, if you take a program like Word or so, it becomes so complicated. It performs literally hundreds of tasks at the same time. So these days, maybe even word processing would parallelize well. But the bottom line is, a lot of problems are serial in nature. And then they're not great for graphics hardware. Okay, so that's the reason why you still have a CPU, because the CPU is optimized for dealing with serial problems, right? Dealing with bad serial code. Really, today's CPUs spend most of their die space. If you look at a CPU, right? If you look at an AMD or Intel CPU, what are they all made of? Like if you just look at the die space and you ignore the GPU, which is also on the CPU these days, right? If you ignore the GPU part, you see there's a little bit of computational hardware, and then there's tons of cache. And cache is really mostly there for dealing with awfully programmed software, right? Because you access the same data multiple times, so you want to preload that and all of these things, okay? So CPUs are optimized for one thing, it is dealing with serial code, dealing in particular with legacy code, and graphics cards don't have these issues because they're pretty new, again, 10, 20 years, which is relatively new, and they just deal with parallel problems. So it's a highly parallel architecture, and it's restricted, and it's generally used for graphics, or it was used for graphics. I mean, these days you sometimes get the feeling that all the graphics cards are used for Bitcoin mining or whatever mining, and they're hard to buy for that reason. But actually figuring out hash values for Bitcoin or Ethereum are problems that also parallelize immensely well. Okay, so this is also why graphics cards are used for that purpose, and they're hard to buy. So let's look at one of those graphics cards. And I think this one is an image of an NVIDIA Kepler GPU. And I don't get paid by NVIDIA, so it's really just a random choice that I made because they happen to have nice images of their graphics card on their webpage, so I could easily use them here. But the basic architecture is very similar for all the three major graphics card manufacturers. The three ones are obviously NVIDIA, as I just mentioned here. There's obviously AMD, and there's Intel. They also are big. I think Intel is actually the biggest graphics card manufacturer in the world still, because, well, they're integrated into all of their chips. So how do these things look like? And again, this year is the same Kepler graphics card. The basic architecture hasn't really changed. You just have more and more units. That's it. And recently you see these ray tracing units pop up, but those aren't the ones that we're interested here because they perform a different type of ray tracing, funny enough. So we can't really use them, or we don't need them for doing volume rendering. So what you see here is the following, okay? And notice how that image, so this here is an actual photograph, and notice how that photograph and this image here look similar, right? You get this block in the center, and here you also got this block in the center. You just see that here in the real physical world, this center piece is way smaller than the stuff around it is here. Okay, so the stuff on top and the bottom, the green and yellow lines, they're actually, this stuff is actually pretty big. And this here, it says cache. So there's also some cache these days on graphics cards, but what you see is that most of the die space is dedicated to these little blocks here. And those are your processors. Okay, so those are your cores, right? And you see there's a ton of them, right? There's actually two types of cores. There's special purpose cores, and then there's general purpose cores. I don't want to talk about that too much, but there's cores that are, the special purpose cores are for things such as sine, cosine, specific functions. And the general purpose cores are for all the rest. But the thing that I'm trying to get across here is a little bit memory, yes, but most of the core, most of the die is actually cores, just one after the other. And they're generally put in blocks so that the engineers can design the chips easier. So they just kind of put blocks on a die and they can scale them. Or if one of those blocks in manufacturing is broken, they can just disable that and sell it as a cheaper card, which allows them to deal with these gigantic chips in some efficient way. Okay, so what do we got? We got a ton of processors. We got multiple texture render targets. That means what's a texture render target? Why do I suddenly talk in graphics terms here, where previously I was talking about compute terms? Well, after all, this thing is a graphics card, right? So what this means, if I want to write data out, I generally write into textures, either the frame buffer or an off-screen texture, but it's generally a texture. So, but I have the ability now for roughly 20 years now to write into multiple memory locations simultaneously. I have a ton of memory, so I don't know the exact figures these days, but I think you can get a 128 gig graphics card probably, or 64 gig, but it's somewhere in the 2 or low 3-digit space gigabytes of memory, but a ton. You can do computations in floating point, right? Which is something where you would say, of course I can do computation in floating point. Well, it's not so, of course, for graphics card. There used to be, a lot of the computations used to be done with significantly lower precision, but you have floating point, you also have double precision these days. So you can also do a 64-bit floating point computation. What's interesting though is that I've actually put in here 4 times 32-bit, and the 4 is kind of a key idea here. So it's often the case that you want to write multiple values simultaneously. Okay, so the 4 obviously comes from RGBA, right? So 4 component textures are kind of the normal thing when you do straightforward computer graphics rasterization. But keep that in mind when we do anything else but just straightforward graphics, what these cards were initially meant for. We should remember what were they built for, and they were built for writing blocks of data. So we always want to write blocks of data. So yeah, we don't just have floating point data types, we also do the computation in floating point. And again, that's a thing that was not always the case with graphics cards. So you would have floating point values that would actually be computed in lower precision. We have all the other stuff. So we have dynamic flow control, if then else, branches, and the whole thing is wired by some reasonable bus to the main system. Yeah, you could call the 4 components whatever you want. You could call them RGBA or XYZW, but effectively it's always 4 components, right? Yeah. So sometimes it might be position, sometimes it might be colors, whatever. Okay, so the bottom line here is just basically today you can do pretty much whatever you want with a graphics card, right? I mean, you could probably run a word processor on a graphics card if you would be crazy enough. I guess it's not worth going through the process of porting it, but it's certainly possible. Okay, so you have general purpose computation on graphics processing units, which is generally abbreviated as GPGPU, general purpose computation on graphics processing units. And again, Bitcoin mining, or I think most graphics cards would actually be used for Ethereum mining, but that's a typical GPGPU application. But volume rendering is also one. What do we have? Well, we have tons of memory, which wasn't always the case, right? When I started with my first graphics card, I think had, I don't know, 128 kilobytes of memory or something. So not much. I mean, I have to admit that my CPU at the time had 2 megabytes of memory, but nonetheless, so that has increased significantly. And the bottom line is really, you can do whatever you want. I mean, that's really the thing I'm trying to get at here. You have this parallel architecture. All you need is a parallel problem to make use of all those processors. Okay, and then you can do whatever you want, which amounts to what I call raycasting plus X here. So you can do the GPU-based raycasting that I explained early, where I just traverse array, and more on that, how to do this exactly on a graphics card later on. And we also do an exercise on that. So you'll end up implementing your own GPU-based raycaster, which is really super simple. Just a few lines of code. It's really, really simple. And you can do, since it's so fast, you can generally do stuff on top of that. Additional computation, feature detection, whatever you want. So that's kind of today. So let's go back a little bit. So I call this once upon a time here. So let's try to just classify how the world behaved throughout time, okay? And I try to find an analogy here to like human history. So I would say, okay, well now is future. So let's go back a little bit in time. Let's say industrialization. Okay, so that's just my analogy here. And at some point in time, maybe roughly 15, 20 years ago, we had these first graphics cards where you could do already powerful parallel computation, but there were some restrictions. So you had 3D textures, you had data structures that were 3-dimensional, which is cool if you want to do volumes, right? I mean, having a 3D texture is very useful. And but in particular, the computational power was somewhat limited in terms of like what instruction you could execute. And at that time, there was an approach being used that was called slice-based volume rendering. Okay, and that idea is pretty similar to the idea of the Chinese artist that I presented a few minutes ago. And that is, okay, let's just, if this is my volume and I'm looking here from the left, let's just cut this into these glass slices and then just sample the volume, okay? Sample the volume, not along a ray, but sample it along the slice, and then just draw the slices from back to front or front to back on top of each other. Okay, so here's what this would look like. Okay, on the left, you see just the wireframe of all those slices. Then in the center, you see those slices getting drawn. Okay, and then if you do enough of those slices, then at some point, those the discretization vanishes and you have the appearance of a continuous volume, which in this case is just a distance function from the center. So you get this spherical shape. Okay, so that was kind of, at some point in time, the accepted way of doing volume rendering. And for some, in particular, older systems, older visualization, it's still state of the art. So some older visualization systems, they still use this approach. It's still super fast because all I have to do is draw a bunch of slices. So those are planes, cross sections of a volume, and just draw them on top of each other. I mean, if you just pick your favorite graphics card these days, I mean, just go online, look up whatever latest Radeon card or latest NVIDIA card or latest Intel card and check how many triangles they can draw per second. You get a humongous, gigantic number, right? I mean, so you can imagine how many of those slices I can draw per second, how fast this will go. So it's pretty fast. So that's one way of doing this. And notice how there's a little bit of a difference here between this approach and the approach by the artist. What's the difference? Well, the difference is here I would compute those slices on the fly. So when the volume rotates, I would recompute those slices. Whereas the artist, he of course, I mean, he created the piece of art once, and then when you look at it and you change your viewport, of course, the art stays constant. I mean, it's an analog, it's a real physical device, right? So he would decide he would decide for one direction, and you can pick any, but he picked one for you. And then there's one direction where you see the volume, and then if you look from the side, at some point, if you look at 90 degrees angle, the volume will actually vanish because you look in between the slices, right? So to avoid this issue, we would recompute the slices to stay perpendicular to the viewing direction, okay? Because we don't have to actually create a physical piece of hardware. So, and here's an animation of that. So I wrote a little bit of code that would actually do exactly that and run it with a C60 molecule data set that I've shown a couple of times. And here you see how those slices, when the data set rotates, or the camera rotates, I mean the same thing, right? You see how those slices change, right? So we cut through the data set differently. Of course, those are just, that's a ridiculously small amount of slices. If I do more, here I do about 100, you see that I get this continuous appearance. There's still some artifacts, so that's not a compression artifact. You see this flickering here. That's actually on purpose, or that's a drawback of that method. So you see that there's some flickering going on here, and those are the very first slices. If the volume is extremely close to the entry point, you actually get a few artifacts. So that's a drawback of this method. Okay, but other than that, if you draw a significant amount of slices, a sufficient amount of slices, you actually get a pretty good idea of the volume. It's relatively easy to implement, and it's very fast. Okay, so that was industrialization. Now let's go back even further to the Dark Ages. Okay, again, my analogy to human history. So if we go further back about the time where I started to do computer graphics, we had something that was called TNL graphics cards. So that stands for transform and lighting. Which basically means that the graphics card could do the vertex processing that we today see. And here I put together, here's an image of one of those cards. So that's a GeForce card, early GeForce cards, and even the ones before that. So they weren't really capable of doing all those fancy computation. They didn't have 3D texture support. 3D textures came out. They were pushed by a game called Doom, or more precisely Quake. So actually when ID Software worked on Quake, they realized, okay, we want to do volumetric effects. So we need a 3D data structure. So they kind of pushed for a 3D data structure, which was in the OpenGL standard, but not supported by general hardware. So they kind of proposed to the graphics card vendors, if you want to run Quake, get 3D textures in there. The funny story is that the vendors actually did implement 3D textures, but Quake never used it in the end, but that's a different story. So, but bottom line is, before Quake, only 2D textures were supported, 3D textures simply weren't supported. So that's bad if you have a 3D volume and you can't just do a 3D array on the hardware, you are in some sort of a problem here. Okay, so how did scientists deal with that situation? They would do object or axis aligned slices, which is really exactly what that Chinese artist did. So if I only have 2D textures, if I only have 2D arrays, I can create, well, a stack of 2D arrays, and that's really what this Chinese artist did. So I, as a programmer, decide upfront which is the direction you should look at. I slice the volume ahead of time into, when I'm still on the CPU, on the main processor. Of course, I can do a 3D array on a CPU, okay? So I just compute 2D subslices of the 3D array, store each in one texture, and then just send those 100 textures to the graphics card. What I can't do is then tilt the textures, because, well, I mean, I could rotate them, but then I end up with the same problem. If I rotate that to 90 degrees, I look in between the slices, so I don't see anything. But that is possible. And the other thing, you could just give up. Okay, so that was just for completeness sake, in those dark ages of graphics cards. You could also say, well, it doesn't work, so I'll just do it on the CPU. It's going to be dead slow, but at least it works. Okay, so that's sort of kind of the history of these approaches. And the interesting thing is that this like pretty modern art, I mean, this artist is active today, is sort of what we used to do roughly 20, 25, 30 years ago to do volume rendering. Okay. And now there's an interesting take to that. There's this dark side of today, as I want to call it here. So there are actually setups. It's decreasing, it's shrinking, but there are actually GPUs that have trouble with 3D textures. Some mobile GPUs can have issues in particular, right? Because 3D textures, I mean, it wasn't used in Quake, and it's certainly not used in many games. And in particular, mobile GPUs are driven by games. Right? Desktop GPUs also used to be driven by games when it comes to development. Today, this has changed a little bit. Generally, we have so much power that most games are actually okay with graphics card, and all they need is just more processors, more memory, but not necessarily more functionality. So the functionality and also the debugging and the quality of the driver was driven by games, and it still is in the mobile sector. But for PCs, there's other applications that also drive quality control these days. But nonetheless, it exists, the problem exists. And what's curious about mobile graphics cards in particular, they do have some issues with 3D textures. I mean, it's fading away, so they get better and better. But they do have some issues with graphics, with 3D textures. But interestingly, they have all this programmable graphics hardware. And there's an interesting thing that you can then do with that hardware. And you can also do this with a desktop system. Let's just look at what do we have so far. We have on one side, we have this idea of raycasting, like following a ray, right? Sampling the ray at equidistant steps or steps. They don't have to be equidistant. We sample the ray at some stepping, and we grab the values and then we do some compositing, either front to back or back to front. So that's what I proposed without even going into the implementation. I proposed as a solution to the rendering equation. So that's kind of the gold standard. That's probably the best thing you can do, okay, in terms of quality. On the other hand, so that's one side of the end, right? So this is today. On the other hand, we have this ancient dark ages situation where we don't have 3D textures. We were restricted in tons of ways, or we were restricted in tons of ways, and we would do this slicing as this Chinese artists do. Okay, and that would look kind of like this here, right? So as I said, about 35 years ago, or 25 years ago, we would do it this way. We would just compute these slices ahead of time, and then would run into this problem. What happens if the viewer kind of starts to rotate the object or the camera, right? At some point, you would see those slices, right? And what's the simple trick is, well, you have 3 of those stacks at hand. Okay, so I simply switch to another version of the same volume that just happens to be sliced differently. And then when this rotation continues, I would again have a great situation. Okay, so what this means is that if I rotate the object, I would continuously switch between these 2 slices, and then the third one is needed, by the way, if I go up or down, right? So you can, this way you can keep those issues at minimum. Of course, you have kind of a bad spot, and that is at 45 degrees, right? So for two reasons. First of all, you might somewhat see those slices because you start to look in between. And the second issue is that if I switch here from red to blue, you see how different points are actually sampled, right? For instance, here I sample this position here, right? Whereas here I don't. Right? Of course, if my slices get closer and closer together, also my samples will get closer together, but I actually have different pieces of data in there. And that might be visible, because if there's like a very obvious sample here, right, someone that has an extremely high value, it won't show up here, but it will suddenly show up here. So you get, again, artifacts that pop up. Okay, so this is a method that is roughly 25 years old. And that doesn't get used these days often because, well, because of those quality issues, right? You have these stack switching artifacts and so on. So it's not a technique that you would use in most applications today. You would just use straightforward raycasting. So why do I mention that? Well, not just because to pay tribute to Christoph Rest-Salama, who proposed this about 20 years ago, because it's still useful. That's a funny thing. Okay, because let's say this is the worst you can do. Okay, so this is really bad, 2D slices, stack switching artifacts. On the other hand, we have raycasting, super cool. Now let's look at the super cool raycasting for just a second. And let's assume we have a parallel universe, we have a parallel projection. Okay, so that means we don't start at a specific eye point, but all our rays are parallel. Okay, so that's what's called orthographic projection. And surprisingly, that's actually very popular in many science domains. It's the only thing that gets used in medicine. So perspective projection is hardly ever used in medicine, and also in other domains. It's often parallel projection is used. If you look at a parallel projected image, and in particular start to rotate that, it looks very unnatural, but it has the huge advantage that things that are further away and nearby, they have the same size. Obviously, that's what parallel projection does. And this allows you to perform measurements better. Okay, so it's a very popular thing. So, okay, now what happens if I do raycasting with a parallel projection? Okay, let's see. My rays, so what I do is I sample along the ray, right? So where's my first sample? Okay, well, it's at the entry point. Now I step with a certain sampling distance. I get, again, those are all of my samples, the second sample from all rays, third samples from all rays, and so on and so forth. So what do we observe? Well, we observe that in that very special case, that we look axis aligned and we have a parallel projection. Surprisingly, our like super cool raycasting method and our super shitty 2D texture approach from 25 years ago happens to be exactly the same. Which is interesting because raycasting is more computational intense. So the shitty method with all those 2D textures, it's way faster. So now you can say, well, okay, sure, well, there's this one like super strange situation where two methods happen to be the same, but what's for a reasonable situation? Okay, let's just tilt the volume a little bit. Let's rotate that a little bit and see what happens. Again, parallel projection, rotated volume. Here, something different must happen. And of course it does, right? So that's our first sample point, right? So all of our arrays, of course, I mean, we might sample the empty space, but if you do a reasonable implementation, you start at the entry point. So this is our first sample point, okay? And that's, of course, very different, right? So our first sample point is here, right? Whereas our sample for the previous method, that would have been here, right? So, okay, so it's different. But let's look what happens next. So next thing is we do some stepping, right? So again, we step some delta d, some distance. So let's just follow all of those parallel rays for some step size d, okay? So this one's d, that's d, it's the same d everywhere. So what we get is our second sample points are here. And let's just continue this process for a while. And that's basically the sampling pattern that we get, okay? So let me just cut this through at this line here. So what do we get? Well, it turns out that, again, our super cool, fast, high quality renderer happens to be almost the same as our crappy slice renderer, except that, well, one part is rendered with one of those stacks and the other part is rendered with another stack, and we have a different step size, right? Notice that even though the step size along the ray is constant, since this is tilted, right, the step size of those planes is different. Okay? But nonetheless, it turns out in raycasting, when we actually can do whatever we want, we end up doing the same stuff as this slice-based approach, at least when we have a parallel projection, right? We just do it at, well, different spacings. And if you look at the math properly, you can actually compute it. It's related to the secant, which in turn is related to sine and cosine. So you can actually compute these distances fairly easily. They just depend on the angle of rotation. Okay, so now you could say, well, all we have to do is to get the high quality raycasting at the performance of this crappy approach is we just cut the volume, and it's pretty easy to cut, right? I mean, where is it cut? It's simply cut along the front-facing edges. I mean, this vertex here is, of course, if it's a cube, that's an edge. So if I just extend this front-facing edge in the viewing direction, I can cut the volume, just render every piece separately with a crappy approach and just adjust my distance between the slices according to, well, that simple function here, which is a constant over the entire frame. You can say, okay, well, that's interesting, but, well, I want to do this in perspective rendering. I don't care about that all visualization research uses parallel projection. I mean, perspective is better, right? Okay, so cool. Let's put this into perspective. Let's actually take the parallel projection and let's draw this perspectively correct. So I now already start from a point. What do we get? We get almost the same pattern, right? It's slightly different, as you can see. Now those aren't parallel lines, they're actually curved. But since we start from planes, that's the whole key point. Since we start from planes, these things remain sort of planar. And let me overlay this with the parallel projection. So there's hardly any difference between the samples in perspective and in parallel projection. They're just placed a little bit different, but they're placed pretty much along the same slices. Okay. So now what we can do is, and that's kind of an interesting insight, we can take this ancient technique and just perform it up to 3 times for 3 quadrants of the cube. And we get pretty much the same result. So what you see here in the center is, for very low sampling rates, is raycasting. On the right, you see the stack switching thing from about 20 years ago. And on the left, you see a combination of those layers, but I don't switch from one layer to the other. I'll just render the volume like cut into particular pieces. Okay, and well, if you draw enough slices, you can still see, in particular on the right, you see some artifacts when the stacks are being switched. But here you can see that the sampling pattern is really pretty much the same. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting insight, that you don't have to do this raycasting process. You can get away with some much more simple hardware. And remember, what would that be useful, in particular for devices that don't support 3D textures, that have some issues? You can just slightly adjust your method. It's a little bit tricky to implement, though. So there's a couple of issues that you have to observe. For instance, the secant tends to strive toward infinity for tangent planes, so you have to catch these cases. So the implementation is a little bit nasty, and the raycaster's implementation is very simple. So that's why we're not doing it in the exercise. But it's just one of the things that I want you to remember, is that sometimes there's relatively simple, straightforward approaches if you just look at what you actually end up doing when you implement one approach over the other and just analyze it carefully. Okay, so since we're a little bit over time already, about 10 minutes, I want to stop here for today. So that's it for today's visualization stream. I'll continue with this for a little bit next week, and then we will look at, once I'm done with the implementational details of some of those things, I want to look at indirect volume rendering as well. So what if we're not trying to get the full 3D volume? What if we're just trying to get a surface out of that, which will be pretty similar to the marching squares that we've seen for 2-dimensional data sets. Okay, so are there any questions for today? Okay. So it doesn't seem to be the case. If there are no further questions, then that's it for visualization today. There's more lectures coming up in a second. When I quit the stream, you can see a schedule of what other lectures are coming up. Advanced Image Synthesis, and in German, Grundlegende Programmiertechnik, as well as our little late night discussion about computer science and science in general. Thank you very much for attendance. That's it for today. As usual, bye-bye, stay healthy, get your vaccination if you can, and see you on one of the next streams.